That morning had started like every other morning for the past 18 months. Check the bank account. Wince. Count the bills. Panic. Kiss his son goodbye and promise him things would get better. Even though Thane wasn't sure he believed it anymore. $127. That's all that stood between him and losing custody of Jake forever. $127 to prove to the family court judge that he could still provide, that the accident hadn't broken him completely, that a man with a diver's tremor could still be a father worth keeping. The call had come at dawn. A maritime insurance company needed someone desperate enough to dive the treacherous waters near Annapolis for salvage work. Cash job. No questions asked. Double rate because the currents were brutal and the water was freezing. Thane had been underwater for 20 minutes, his wetsuit fighting the Maryland cold, when he felt it. That deep, bone-rattling thud that every Navy diver knows means something catastrophic has happened above. He surfaced into chaos. A quarter-mile offshore, a luxury yacht was burning like a Roman candle against the steel-gray morning sky. The kind of vessel that cost more than most people made in a lifetime, now crackling and hissing as it tilted toward the depths. Thane treaded water, squinting through the salt spray and smoke, when he saw it. A flash of champagne-colored fabric sinking fast beneath the flames. Someone was down there. Someone was drowning. His hands shook as he checked his air gauge. 10 minutes left, maybe 12 if he pushed it. The smart thing would be to surface, call the Coast Guard, let the professionals handle it. But Thane had been running from being called broken for 18 months, and something deep in his chest refused to let another person slip away on his watch. He dove. The water turned from gray to black as he descended, his headlamp cutting through the gloom like a sword. Debris from the explosion drifted around him. Pieces of hull, shattered glass, a life preserver that would never save anyone. And there, 20 feet down and sinking fast, was a young woman in an evening gown, her long dark hair streaming behind her like seaweed. Heavy rope was wrapped around her ankles, weighted down with what looked like a boat anchor. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to make sure she never surfaced. Thane's training kicked in, muscle memory from 1,000 Navy rescues flooding back despite the tremor in his hands. He reached her just as she disappeared into the deeper darkness, her pale face turned upward, lips already blue with cold. Her eyes were closed, but he could see the faint flutter of bubbles escaping her nose. Still alive. Barely. His dive knife cut through the rope in 3 savage strokes. The anchor tumbled away into the abyss as Thane wrapped his arms around the woman and kicked hard toward the surface. She was lighter than he expected, fragile, like something precious that had been thrown away. His lungs burned, his air gauge hit the red zone, and the tremor in his hands made every movement a fight against his own body. When they broke the surface, Thane gasped for air and tilted her head back, checking for breath. Nothing. He started rescue breathing right there in the water, his lips pressed to hers as he forced life back into her lungs. Once, twice. On the third breath, she convulsed and coughed up seawater, her dark eyes snapping open in terror. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice raw with cold and adrenaline. "I've got you." But as he looked toward shore, Thane realized safety was the last thing either of them had. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows were parked along the waterline, men in expensive suits standing beside them like undertakers waiting for a funeral. They weren't rescue workers. They weren't Coast Guard. They were the ones who had tried to kill her, and now they were coming for both of them. The woman in his arms looked up at Thane with eyes that held secrets worth killing for, and he made a choice that would either save his family or destroy everything he had left. He swam not toward the beach, but toward the abandoned pier where his salvage boat was moored, toward the world of rust and shadows he knew better than anyone. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The ATM screen glowed like a death sentence in the pre-dawn darkness. Available balance: $127. Thane stared at the numbers until they blurred, his coffee growing cold in the cup holder of his battered Ford pickup. Jake's school fees were due in 3 days. $800 for the private academy that was supposed to give his son the future Thane could no longer provide. Without that payment, Jake would be transferred to the overcrowded public school where kids like him, sons of broken fathers, got lost in the system. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the job listings one more time. Maritime salvage, emergency dive work, hull inspections that paid cash under the table because insurance companies didn't want divers with tremors on their official payroll. Most of the postings required certifications he'd lost when the accident happened, or equipment he'd sold months ago to keep the lights on. Then he saw it. A new listing posted just 20 minutes ago: urgent salvage work near Annapolis. Hazardous conditions. $2,000 cash. Experienced divers only. No questions asked. Thane's hands shook as he dialed the number. The voice that answered was clipped, professional, with the kind of East Coast accent that meant serious money. You available right now? Weather window closes in 3 hours. Bring your own gear. I'll be there, Thane said before he could talk himself out of it. An hour later, he was suited up on the deck of his salvage boat. A rust-streaked 30-footer he'd bought for scrap value and patched together with hope and marine epoxy. The Chesapeake stretched before him like hammered steel, choppy and unforgiving under the gray October sky. The client had been vague about what exactly needed salvaging, but the GPS coordinates led to deep water, the kind where things disappeared forever if you weren't careful. Thane checked his equipment one more time. Single tank, 40 minutes of air if he was conservative. Dive knife, headlamp, emergency beacon that probably wouldn't work this far from shore. His hands trembled as he tested the regulator. That damn tremor that had cost him his commercial license flaring up like an old wound in the cold. The water was 37 degrees and black as engine oil when he went under. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet once he passed the thermocline. His headlamp beam swallowed by the murk. He followed the anchor line down, watching his depth gauge climb 60 feet, 80, 90. Whatever had sunk here was big. That's when the shockwave hit. The explosion above sent a pressure wave through the water that knocked him sideways, his ears popping from the sudden compression. Debris began raining down around him. Chunks of fiberglass, twisted metal, something that looked like a piece of mahogany deck railing. Thane looked up and saw the orange glow of flames dancing on the surface, casting hellish shadows through the water. He surfaced into chaos. A quarter-mile away, a luxury yacht was burning like a Viking funeral pyre, listing hard to starboard as it took on water. The kind of vessel that cost more than most people's houses, now crackling and hissing as it died. Smoke billowed across the water, carrying the acrid smell of burning fuel and melting plastic. That's when he saw her, a flash of champagne-colored fabric, sinking fast beneath the flames. At first he thought it was just debris, but then he saw the long dark hair streaming behind like seaweed, the pale flash of skin. Someone was down there. Someone was drowning. Thane checked his air gauge. 35 minutes left, maybe 40 if he was careful. The smart thing would be to call the Coast Guard, let the professionals handle it. But he'd spent 18 months being called broken, useless, a liability. His hands might shake, but his conscience was still steady. He dove toward the burning wreck. The water turned from gray to black as he descended, following the trail of debris toward the yacht's final resting place. His headlamp cut through the gloom, revealing the ghostly outline of the vessel settling onto a ledge 60 feet down. The hull was cracked open like an egg, spilling its contents into the abyss. And there, 20 feet below the wreck and sinking fast, was the woman in the evening gown. Heavy rope was wrapped around her ankles, weighted down with what looked like a boat anchor. This wasn't an accident. Someone had made sure she would never surface. Thane reached her just as she disappeared into the deeper darkness. Her face was turned upward, lips already blue with cold, but he could see the faint stream of bubbles escaping her nose. Still alive. Barely. His dive knife made quick work of the rope, 3 savage cuts that sent the anchor tumbling into the abyss. The woman, she couldn't be more than 25, floated free, her champagne gown billowing around her like a shroud. Thane wrapped his arms around her waist and kicked hard toward the surface, fighting against the weight of her waterlogged dress and his own burning lungs. When they broke into the gray morning light, he immediately tilted her head back and checked for breathing. Nothing. He started rescue breathing right there in the choppy water, his lips pressed to hers as he forced air into her lungs. Once, twice. On the third breath, she convulsed and coughed up seawater, her dark eyes snapping open in pure terror. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice raw from the cold. "I've got you." But even as he said it, Thane knew it wasn't true. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows had appeared along the shoreline like vultures, men in expensive suits standing beside them with the patient stillness of professional killers. They weren't rescue workers. They weren't Coast Guard. They were the ones who had tried to murder her. Thane didn't head for shore. Instead, he swam toward his salvage boat, half carrying, half dragging the woman through the swells. She was conscious but weak, coughing up seawater and shivering violently in his arms. When they reached the boat's dive platform, it took all his strength to haul her aboard. "Can you hear me?" he asked, wrapping her in an emergency blanket from his gear bag. "What's your name?" She looked at him with eyes that seemed too old for her face, dark brown and filled with shadows. They tried to. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the seawater. "Don't talk. Save your strength." Thane fired up the boat's engine and headed not for the main harbor, but toward the maze of creeks and backwater channels he knew from years of salvage work. Places where black SUVs couldn't follow, where a man could disappear if he knew the tides. His workshop sat on a forgotten spit of land 20 minutes up Muddy Creek, accessible only by water at high tide. It had been a crab shack once, before the bay's pollution killed the local industry. Now it was Thane's refuge, part garage, part junkyard, part fortress against a world that had written him off. He carried the woman inside, her weight almost nothing in his arms. The workshop smelled of motor oil and rust, lit by fluorescent tubes that cast harsh shadows across workbenches cluttered with salvaged marine equipment. He laid her on an old couch in the corner, the one piece of furniture that reminded him this place had once been someone's home. "Where am I?" she whispered, struggling to sit up. "Safe," Thane said, though the word felt hollow. He heated water on a camp stove and found clean clothes, his spare coveralls that would swallow her small frame. "Those men on the beach, do you know who they were?" Terror flashed across her face. "The traitor," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "Uncle Marcus." He was supposed to. But then the boat. Her eyes rolled back and she slumped against the couch cushions, unconscious again. Thane checked her pulse, steady but weak. The gash on her hairline had stopped bleeding, but she needed real medical attention. The problem was, taking her to a hospital meant questions, paperwork, police reports, and whoever had tried to kill her once would certainly try again. He made coffee and stood watch at the workshop's single window, scanning the creek for any sign of pursuit. The black SUVs had been too clean, too coordinated. Professional muscle, the kind that corporations hired when legal solutions weren't enough. But why try to kill a young woman in an evening gown? What could she possibly know that was worth murder? The answer came at sunset, when she finally woke up properly. "My name is Alara," she said, accepting the mug of hot coffee he offered. Her voice was stronger now, though her hands still shook. Alara Blackwood. The name hit Thane like a physical blow. Blackwood Maritime, one of the largest shipping conglomerates on the East Coast. Container ships, oil tankers, and enough political influence to make problems disappear permanently. He'd heard the name before, seen it in the maritime trade journals he still read out of habit. "Your father," he said slowly, "is Nathaniel Blackwood." She nodded, wrapping the oversized coveralls tighter around her frame. "I was supposed to be at the company yacht for a board meeting. Dad wanted to announce his retirement, hand control to the next generation. But Uncle Marcus," her face crumpled, "he said Dad was getting too old, that the company needed new leadership. I thought he meant me. I didn't know he meant himself. So he tried to kill you. Make it look like an accident. Yacht explosion, tragic loss, grieving uncle forced to take control of the company to honor his brother's legacy." She laughed bitterly. "Except you ruined it. You saved me when I was supposed to die." Outside, Thane heard the distant growl of engines. He moved to the window and peered through the salt-stained glass. A black SUV with New York plates was creeping along the access road, moving slowly like a shark testing the water. It paused at the locked gate that marked the entrance to his property, then backed up and disappeared into the treeline. They'd found him. It was only a matter of time before they found a way in. "We need to call your father," Thane said. "Tell him what happened." Alara shook her head. "Marcus controls the company communications. Dad's been isolated. All his calls go through the corporate switchboard now." She looked at Thane with desperate eyes. "You don't understand. My uncle has been planning this for months. Dad thinks I'm dead. By the time he learns the truth, Marcus will have consolidated power completely. Then we go public. News media, police. With what proof? A traumatized heiress claims her uncle tried to kill her? Marcus will spin it as a breakdown, have me committed for psychiatric evaluation. Game over." Thane stared out at the darkening creek, his mind racing. He was a salvage diver with a tremor and a bank account that could barely feed his son. What chance did he have against a shipping empire worth billions? But looking at Alara, young, terrified, and completely dependent on his protection, he realized choice had nothing to do with it. "Then we make our own proof," he said finally. "And we pray your uncle makes a mistake." The SUV returned an hour later, joined by two more. They parked just outside his property line and waited, engines running, headlights cutting through the gathering dusk like predators' eyes. Thane counted at least 6 figures moving in the darkness, professionals who knew how to hunt. The siege had begun. The phone call came at dawn, cutting through the silence of the workshop like a blade. Thane had been awake all night, watching the SUVs through the salt-stained windows, counting shadows and calculating odds that kept getting worse. When the satellite phone on Alara's recovered purse finally rang, he almost didn't answer it. "This is Nathaniel Blackwood." The voice was aged but commanding, carrying the weight of decades in boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made with a nod. "I believe you have my daughter." Thane glanced at Alara, who had gone rigid on the couch. She shook her head frantically, mouthing the word, "trap," over and over. "She's safe," Thane said carefully. "For now. I want her back, Mr. Morrison. I've had my people look into you. Former Navy diver. Lost your commercial license after that accident in Baltimore. You have a son, Jake, age 8, currently enrolled at Riverside Academy, though I understand the tuition is challenging for a man in your position." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thane's jaw clenched. "What are you offering?" $5 million. Cash transfer within the hour. All I need is a location where my security team can collect Alara safely. You walk away. Your son's education is secured for life, and this unfortunate incident disappears completely. It was more money than Thane had ever dreamed of, enough to solve every problem that had been crushing him for the past 18 months. But something in the old man's tone made his skin crawl. Too eager, too rehearsed, like a script he'd practiced. "Your security team," Thane said slowly. "Would that be the same people who tried to drown your daughter last night?" Silence stretched across the connection. When Blackwood spoke again, his voice had changed, become colder. "Mr. Morrison, you're playing with forces beyond your understanding. Take the money. Walk away. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. No deal." Thane ended the call and immediately pulled the battery from the phone. Alara was staring at him like he'd lost his mind. "Do you have any idea what you just turned down? That was enough money to what? Buy your father's approval for having you killed." Thane moved to the window, scanning the creek for new threats. "That wasn't your father on the phone. Or if it was, he's already been compromised. You don't know that. I know the sound of a man reading from a script. And I know your Uncle Marcus has had all night to get to dear old Dad. Convince him that his traumatized daughter is in the hands of a dangerous kidnapper." Thane's hands clenched into fists. "By tomorrow morning, I'll be public enemy number 1. He was right. The news vans arrived before noon, their satellite dishes gleaming like vultures' wings in the overcast sky. Thane watched from the workshop as reporters set up their cameras along the public road, just out of range of the NO trespassing signs but close enough to get good shots of his property. The first broadcast went live at 12:30. Thane caught it on his ancient radio, the static-filled voice of a local reporter painting him as a monster. Sources close to the Blackwood family confirmed that 34-year-old Alara Blackwood, daughter of shipping magnate Nathaniel Blackwood, is being held against her will by Thane Morrison, a disgraced former Navy diver with a history of mental instability. Mental instability. That's how they were spinning the tremor, the PTSD diagnosis from his accident, the desperate poverty that had driven him to take dangerous salvage jobs. By evening, every major news outlet on the East Coast was running with the story. Disturbed veteran, kidnapper, armed and dangerous. "They're destroying you," Alara whispered, her face pale as she listened to the reports. "Everything you've worked for, your reputation, your relationship with your son." Thane thought of Jake, probably watching the news with Mrs. Patterson, seeing his father's face plastered across the screen like a wanted poster. The family court would use this, strip away what little custody he still had. Even if he proved his innocence eventually, the damage would be done. "Doesn't matter now," he said, though his voice betrayed the lie. "We're committed. No going back." The storm rolled in at midnight, a nor'easter that turned the Chesapeake into a churning cauldron of foam and fury. Rain hammered the workshop's metal roof like machine gun fire, and the wind howled through the gaps in the walls with voices that sounded like the damned. Perfect weather for what was coming. They hit the workshop at 2 a.m., when the storm was at its peak. Thane had been expecting them, had spent the day preparing, turning his salvage yard into a maze of traps and obstacles. He'd moved Alara to the hidden compartment beneath his workshop floor, a smuggler's cache left over from the building's rum-running days, and sealed it with a sheet of marine plywood that looked like ordinary flooring. The first SUV smashed through his front gate like it wasn't there. 2 more followed, their headlights cutting through the rain as they surrounded the workshop. Figures in tactical gear poured out, moving with military precision toward his front door. Thane was already gone, slipping out the back as they breached the front. He changed into his diving gear, not the wetsuit, but the full commercial rig he'd worn in the Navy. Dry suit, helmet, weighted boots that would give him traction on the rain-slicked pier. In his hands was the pneumatic nail gun from his workshop, modified with a diving tank to fire 4-inch steel spikes with enough force to punch through body armor. The first mercenary found him on the pier, emerging from the workshop with an automatic rifle. The man never saw Thane coming out of the water beside the pilings. The nail gun's first shot took him in the chest, the 4-inch spike driving through Kevlar like it was tissue paper. He went down without a sound, his rifle clattering into the churning water below. "Target down!" someone shouted from inside the workshop. "Spread out. He's on the pier." Thane moved like a ghost through the maze of salvaged equipment, using the storm and his knowledge of every obstacle to stay ahead of his pursuers. A mercenary rounded a corner and found himself face to face with a crane's hook swinging on a 40-foot cable. The impact lifted him off his feet and deposited him in the creek with a splash that was lost in the storm's fury. Another tried to follow Thane across a section of rotting planking that looked solid but had been deliberately weakened. The boards gave way under the man's weight, dropping him 10 feet into the muddy shallows where Thane had driven a forest of steel rebars just beneath the surface. The scream was brief and final. By the time the remaining mercenaries regrouped, their numbers had been cut in half. Thane could hear them coordinating through their radios, professional soldiers adapting to an environment they hadn't expected. But this was his domain, his rules, and he'd spent 18 months learning every current and tide in these waters. The final confrontation happened at the end of the pier, where his crane sat like a mechanical dinosaur against the storm-torn sky. 3 mercenaries had cornered him there, thinking they had him trapped between their guns and the churning water. They underestimated how comfortable Thane was in his element. He triggered the crane's emergency release just as they opened fire, sending 2 tons of salvaged steel plummeting toward the pier. The mercenaries scattered, but the pier itself shuddered and began to collapse, ancient pilings giving way under the impact. Thane dove into the black water as gunfire erupted behind him, the bullets hissing past his helmet like angry wasps. Underwater, he was untouchable. He swam beneath the pier's wreckage, using his helmet's light to navigate the maze of twisted metal and broken timber. When he surfaced behind the last mercenary, a man in expensive tactical gear who was cursing into his radio, Thane's dive knife found the gap between helmet and body armor with surgical precision. The man dropped without a sound, his radio spattering with static and blood. Silence fell over the salvage yard, broken only by the storm's endless fury. Thane stood in the ruins of his pier, chest heaving, surrounded by the bodies of men who had come to kill him. In the distance, he could see new headlights approaching, more SUVs, or maybe the police finally responding to reports of gunfire. But these vehicles were different. Sleek black sedans with diplomatic plates, flanked by real security personnel who moved with the disciplined precision of professionals rather than killers. They parked at a respectful distance, and a single figure emerged from the lead car. Nathaniel Blackwood was exactly what Thane had expected, tall, silver-haired, radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of commanding corporate empires. But his face showed none of the cold calculation from their phone call. Instead, his eyes held the desperate fear of a father who thought his daughter was dead. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Thane studied the old man's face, looking for deception, for any sign that this was another trap. But all he saw was grief and exhaustion, the weight of a man who had just realized how completely he'd been manipulated. "Safe," Thane said finally. "But first, I need to know. Did you authorize the hit on your daughter?" Blackwood's face went white. "Hit? What hit?" "I was told she'd been kidnapped by an unstable veteran, that these men were private security hired to—" He stopped, looking at the bodies scattered across the pier. "Oh God, what have I done?" "You trusted the wrong people." Thane activated the hidden mechanism that opened Alara's hiding place. She emerged from beneath the workshop floor like a ghost rising from the grave, her face streaked with tears and her eyes wide with relief. "Dad!" Her voice broke on the word. Nathaniel Blackwood aged a decade in that moment, seeing his daughter alive but understanding the full scope of his brother-in-law's betrayal. "Alara! My God! What they told me! I thought you were—" He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she might disappear again. "Marcus said you were dead. The yacht explosion, he showed me pictures of the wreckage, convinced me that this man had somehow survived and was trying to extort." "Marcus ordered the hit," Alara said quietly. He's been planning this for months, isolating you from the company, positioning himself to take control when I was eliminated. If Thane hadn't saved me, Blackwood looked at Thane with new eyes, seeing him not as a kidnapper but as the man who had risked everything to save his daughter from a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of Blackwood Maritime. How much do I owe you? Nothing, Thane said, though the word tasted like ashes in his mouth. His pier was destroyed, his workshop shot full of holes, his reputation in ruins. Even with the truth revealed, rebuilding his life would take years he didn't have. Bullshit. Blackwood's voice carried the steel that had built a maritime empire. You saved my daughter's life and exposed a conspiracy that would have destroyed my company. Name your price. Thane looked out at the wreckage of his salvage yard, then at the distant lights of Jake's school. I want my son to be proud of his father again. I want to stand up straight when people ask what I do for a living. And I want to make sure no one ever calls me broken again. 6 months later, Thane stood on the deck of the Alara's Hope, a state-of-the-art salvage vessel that represented everything he dreamed of owning. 50 feet of cutting-edge marine technology, equipped with the latest diving equipment and search systems. The brass nameplate on the bridge read Morrison Marine Salvage, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Chesapeake Bay Operations. Jake was beside him, wearing a life jacket that was still too big but grinning like he owned the world. Dad, can we dive together when I'm older? When you're certified and old enough to handle the equipment, Thane promised, his hands steady on the ship's wheel. The tremor was still there, it always would be, but it no longer defined him. He was a salvage captain again, with a crew who respected him and a son who looked at him with pride instead of pity. In the distance, another vessel was approaching, one of Blackwood Maritime's new research ships, part of the environmental cleanup initiative that Nathaniel had launched after restructuring his company. Marcus was in federal prison, along with the rest of the conspirators who had tried to murder Alara for corporate control. The radio crackled with a familiar voice. Morrison Marine, this is Blackwood Research. We've got a sonar contact about 2 miles north of your position. Looks like it might be that Civil War wreck you've been hunting. Thane keyed the radio, smiling as he changed course toward the coordinates. Copy that, Blackwood Research. We're on our way. As the Alara's Hope cut through the swells toward their destination, Jake pressed close to his father's side. Tell me again about the night you saved her, Dad. Thane looked down at his son, then out at the endless expanse of the Chesapeake Bay, water that had once nearly killed him, but had ultimately given him back his life. Well, he said, his voice carrying across the waves like a promise. It all started with 37-degree water and a yacht that was burning like the end of the world. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.